You're listening to the Trailblazers podcast, episode 54 with Wesley Lowery.
You're listening to the Trailblazers podcast, where we will explore the stories of successful Black professionals. Join us as we highlight the knowledge, resources, and tools of these accomplished trailblazers to help provide the know-how, confidence, and motivation you need to blaze your trail. And now, here's your host, Stephen Hart.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Trailblazers podcast. This episode is being published on February 6th, 2017. And last week, February 1st, marked our 1-year anniversary of the launch of the Trailblazers podcast. We are so very excited about this 1-year mark. I will be celebrating all month long with our reflection on and also acknowledgement of this month being Black History Month, right? So stay tuned for some cool and amazing things that we've got in store for you, our listeners. So there's this uniqueness to this podcast, right? That's now been downloaded by listeners in almost 90 countries around the world in this our first year. And most of you are Black working professionals who are listening to inspiring stories of other successful Black professionals, right? For the most part, in the prior 53 episodes, I've nearly altogether avoided the discussion of race on the show. And I guess I've wanted to provide an inviting platform to people of all races, allowing for anyone to be at ease while listening to and deriving value from someone who has experienced success and is Black. And so over the past year, I've used Trailblazers to counter the recurring negative race theme in the media, in the mainstream media, with a deliberate and positive mission, right? To create a massive database of valuable and respected Black people whose stories lead us and inspire us to take action towards our own greater purpose and mission. So after saying all that, I would like to introduce today's featured guest, who was brought on to discuss race and the racial justice movement in America today. You know, I think this was a good episode, but I have to tell you, the injustices around police shootings of unarmed Black men and women over the past several years has brought about a sense of hopelessness and frustration unlike anything I've ever felt. And it is very much a very real part of our history, our Black history, and our lives. And we're affected by it today. And our kids are affected by it today. And we need to be more deliberate to understand what's happening and know more than the media tells us. So though this month, Black History Month, we celebrate the leaders, the civil rights leaders, and the people from our past that went before us to hopefully provide a better today. There's still some real issues that we're facing. And so our featured guest is Wesley Lowery. And Wes Lowery is a Pulitzer Prize winning national reporter for the Washington Post. And Wes covers law enforcement and justice. And he was the paper's lead reporter in Ferguson, Missouri, covering the Black Lives Matter protest movement, and was a member of the team that was awarded the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for coverage of the police shootings. Wes is also the author of a new book titled They Can't Kill Us All. And we'll talk about some of this in today's episode. Just a quick disclaimer, Wes was on a cell phone for the call, and there are a couple brief pockets where the audio is a little less than ideal. And, you'll hear everything you need to hear, but I just wanted to let you know I'm aware of the audio kinks. And, I decided to go ahead and bypass those. I encourage everyone to listen. And feel free to connect with me, on social or through email or however you need to. I'm at TBPod just about everywhere on social media. Feel free to share your thoughts on today's discussion. And that's it. Let's dive into today's episode with our trailblazer, Wesley Lowery. Wes, thanks so much for coming on to the podcast.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
So you are an Ohio native, born and bred, right? Who grew up in Cleveland.
Of course. Grew up in Cleveland. Yep, outside of Cleveland.
Are you a Cavs fan?
I am a Cavs fan, so it's been a good year for me.
That's right. So I read that you attended Shaker Heights High School and went on to Ohio University. For
yes.
Those that don't know, that's one of America's oldest universities, right?
Yep, founded in 1804. They used to call it the Harvard on the Hocking River. This little OU, Ohio trivia. But yes, beautiful campus.
I'm curious, did growing up in Cleveland and attending these schools have an impact on your decision to become a journalist?
Well, of course. I mean, a big part of it was that, the high school I went to in Shaker has a really great high school journalism program.
Right.
And so I was like a member of my high school newspaper from the first day I was on campus as a high schooler, right?
Wow.
And so so I've been like doing journalism almost every day since I was 13 or 14 years old. And so that obviously played a large role in my decision to keep doing it. And then by the time it was time for me to start thinking about colleges, I knew several people from the high school paper who had gone on to work for college papers. And so they were helping me look at journalism schools. And then, OU, Ohio University, has a great journalism program, the Scripps School. And so I, went there and immediately kind of dove into the newspaper on campus and, journalism classes. And,
Wow.
the rest was kind of history after that.
Wow. That's awesome. Yeah, I saw that they were a nationally recognized high school.
It's great school. Tons of support there. I love getting back anytime I can. I'm really blessed in large parts of the decisions my parents made and kind of where they wanted us to live, that I was always able to go to some, really, really great schools.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading that piece of the book on how you mentioned them calibrating that whole entire experience for you growing up. Your book provides knowledge that, once read can't be talked on that mat. And I had to talk to you about it. And so, I see this talk as an opportunity for us to discuss what you've written about with the racial justice movements that's happening right now, right? And by the way, for those listening, Wes's new book is titled "They Can't Kill Us All." And Wes, we're gonna have a talk here, but for those listening right now, and I'll have you repeat this again at the end of the episode, can you tell us how we can get a copy of this book?
Of course. So it should be available pretty much anywhere where you buy books. Now, Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com are great ways to do it. The audiobook's available on audio. But if you walk into your local bookseller, they should have a copy. If not, harass them and then they can get one. But it should be pretty widely available. And like I said, when in doubt, Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com can get you one quick.
So, I listened to the book in audio, and I have to tell you, I commend you for the body of work that you've captured. And I wanted to ask, why did you write this book?
So one of the reasons I wrote this book was, so my day job is I'm a national reporter for the Washington Post who covers law enforcement, race, justice, right? So I'm the police shooting guy for the Washington Post. Cover Ferguson, cover Baltimore, cover Cleveland, Charleston. And one thing that was frustrating for me was that I would write all these stories time and time again, story after story, article after article about the protest movement and profiling the leaders, profiling the groups that are involved, doing all this writing. And I'd still get these emails from readers. And they'd be like, I just don't get it. Why are people in the streets? What's everyone so upset about? Or, that no matter how much I wrote about it, it felt like it wasn't breaking through.
Yes.
And that we weren't reaching people. And so I thought, what if I could try this in a different medium? What if I could sit down and just write everything I know about one of these topics? What if I could write everything I know about the protest, about the leaders, about these cities, about these shootings? If I could put it all in one place, use all of my notes, all those interviews that never made it into the piece, all that little color, that little detail, maybe then I could provide, one of my readers with a full primer on this protest movement, right? And so the book wasn't necessarily written for people who already know everything about it, who follow it really closely. I think people who follow my coverage very closely will be introduced to familiar characters and familiar places. But in many ways, it was written for those people who had not read, who had not been paying attention, but who still might have some questions about the protest movement.
I know you spent some time working with LA Times and the Boston Globe before, taking this opportunity with the Post. And I believe in the book, you'd mentioned that you were actually covering some political reporting leading up to the events in Ferguson and the Mike Brown shooting. Curious, why did you actually accept the request to go to Ferguson?
Of course. Well, I think it's an interesting question. I was a political reporter. I was covering Congress for the Post. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go on the campaign trail in 2016. That was my big goal or my big aim. I wanted to be a political reporter. But even as I did that, I always had a kind of sensibility and a desire to tell stories that reporters who maybe didn't look like me would not tell. I grew up in and came up in the industry very conscious of issues of diversity and issues of media representation, knowing that very often I might be the only Black person or Black man on a staff. I might be the only person covering the story with my type of background, right? And so I always try to think about whether I was covering local politics in Boston or covering entertainment in LA, or now that I was covering national politics for the Post, how can I make sure that I'm telling stories that maybe other reporters would not consider, would not know to cover, right? And so I always try to think about that. So like on the Hill, for example, when I was covering Congress, that might mean that I would write an extra piece on the attempts to renew the Voting Rights Act that maybe everyone else wouldn't write about that day, but I would take the extra hour and write that. Or maybe I would write about the long-term unemployment benefits and the need to, people who are trying to lobby to get those renewed, even though that wasn't like the sexiest story and a lot of reporters were covering other things. It was like, is this a story that affects people who look like me? Right. How can I make sure that I kind of propel those stories forward? And so when, the shooting happened in Ferguson, Michael Brown was killed on August 9th, 2014. It wasn't necessarily my job, but in the same way I walked over to the national desk and began having a conversation. Is there anything I can do to be helpful? Want me to call the members of Congress from Missouri, right? Maybe they're going to call for a DOJ investigation. Maybe they have some information. We didn't know anything yet, right? So I was always looking for ways to be involved in stories that affected people who look like me. Because I know that, sometimes if I didn't raise my hand, maybe we wouldn't tell that story. Now, I'm sure that wouldn't have been the case with Ferguson. It was so big at that point. Right. But I still always was someone who tried to gravitate towards those types of stories.
Right. And I found that you were one of a very few individuals who grew up outside of the environment of a Ferguson or a Baltimore, or, a number of the other cities that you covered, but still managed to experience those events firsthand as a Black man. You were there, as you shared, you experienced being arrested for no reason. And as I read, and your storytelling is crazy, I really felt like I was present there with you. But, for those listening, what was it like as a young reporter, sitting in a McDonald's in Ferguson, trying to simply do your job, right, and report on what had been happening, and a short while later, being arrested, right? How did it feel as those plastic ties, as you described, wrapped your wrists and those officers ignored your plea for justice?
Well, look, it was deeply frustrating, right? Like, because you feel helpless and powerless in this way. Like this idea that like you've done nothing wrong and you're being not just like arrested, but like inconvenienced. Like, I was here to do my job. Right. And I was doing my job, and I'm like thinking about like the story I'm supposed to be writing right now, or like that quote I was supposed to be sending in, like I was like frustrated at the physical inconvenience. Now that came after, I guess that's the second feeling, because the first feeling is a feeling of like actual fear, right? That's this moment and this feeling of like, because you're so out of control. I think we think very often that we can like reason. And we can, like I'm the kind of person who feels like I can talk myself in or out of anything. Right. Like, oh, they just don't understand it yet. Let me go explain this, or let me talk to, and you have that moment, that physical moment where you're like, you have no control. Someone else is in complete control, and has complete stewardship of my being and like my body and my safety and my, and then after that, it's this feeling of like frustration and inconvenience.
Did you at some point in that moment feel a greater sense of connection to what the people in that community were actually living out?
Well, I definitely think that we had, going through that process, we found, myself and Ryan Riley, the Huffington Post reporter who I was arrested with, we found the police to be remarkably unreasonable. Right. We were just trying to ask like some basic follow-up questions like, hey, what could we have done differently? How might we, can you guys give us your names? Who can we talk to? Is there a superior? And like we just received no good faith interaction back at all. And I just found that, and it was found it very frustrating, even when we, when we parachute into these stories, even stories where we're expected and we are expecting to be critical of the police or the powers that be, the local government, right? We still, as members of the media, very often give the police and the government a huge benefit of the doubt. Right. We kind of assume that like they're good faith actors, they're doing what they're saying they're supposed to do, that the things they tell us must be true, right? And so like we have kind of like these built-in assumptions, and it was, even for me, someone who can be a little bit more cynical and a little more critical, it's kind of striking all of a sudden to like watch the people in authority just so disregard, kind of that type of good faith interaction. The other thing that was interesting was that I think that when we were arrested, there had been hundreds of demonstrators and residents arrested at this point, right? We were far from the first arrest, but we were the first journalists to be arrested.
Yeah.
And I think that was a wake-up call to a lot of friends in the media and a lot of colleagues in the media who, before that,
immunity.
We're just skeptical of everything, and who thought that all these people must deserve it, and like we have to give the police this ultimate benefit of the doubt. And then it was like this moment where I was like, wait a second, this seemed really unreasonable the way they treated these two reporters. If they'll treat these two reporters from DC this way, right, how must they be treating the normal people, right? So I thought it was like a wake up call for the industry about how trusting we are of the police in these instances.
Right. We met this summer, right, tail end of the summer at the Be Modern Man tour. And in that conversation, in that discussion that night, you made a profound comment, which I believe was the only statement actually noted from you. And you said the media coverage on race is incomplete. I'm curious to know, what's been your biggest frustrations with the media as it relates to the racial justice movement? I
think that so often we're very reactionary and we're very short-sighted. So like something will happen, like the shooting of the police officers in Dallas will happen. And we'll immediately be like, wait, is this the end of Black Lives Matter? What's going on? It's like, well, no, it's not. Like, like if we know anything about history, we know that like in the 60s and 70s there are like dozens of cities like being burned to the ground and police officers being killed. And it wasn't the end of the civil rights movement, right? Like that, like so often we just at this very basic level lack any historical understanding even of the world we live in and the country we cover, so that we like react in this very like kind of exaggerated reactionary way without necessarily standing in a place of context and understanding. And I think the other thing too is that we very often cover issues of race as it relates to people's feelings about issues of race, right? As opposed to about the outcomes and the results of policy. And so, like when we have conversations about racism or about prejudice, about the role of race, we in many ways have a very underdeveloped and like very low-level conversation, right? Where we see like a police shooting will happen and people will be like, well, but the officer's black, so how could this be about race? And it's like, well, but that's not how race manifests in police shootings, right? Like, if the way that race impacts fatal police force is not necessarily because an individual racist officer decided he wanted to kill a black person that day, right? Rather, it's a conversation that's about implicit bias. Is there a reason that culturally or societally, perhaps this officer thought this person was more dangerous than they were because they were black? Right. It's about policing policy. Why were the police clearing that corner? Why were they serving that warrant? Why were they, it's about all these other steps and those other avenues where race can enter into the conversation. But so often we just have such a elementary level conversation about race where it's like the first thing anyone wants to know is what the race of the police officer, because if the officer isn't white, then it must not be about race. And it's like, come on guys, it's not how race works. And so that can be really frustrating.
So you touched on Black Lives Matter. Would love to talk about that a little bit. You shared in your book how things likely got started, right, with Alicia Garza. And I think today, people are a lot confused by the Black Lives Matter movement. And again, I think some of it can be contributed to the media's reporting on a lot of the negative sides of the movement and not really highlighting the positives. For the most part, leave a lot of people neutral, right, on the best intentions of the creators and supporters of the movement. I don't know how much of this, you're comfortable speaking to from your vantage point, but as best you can, could you explain how the movement was formed and why it has grown to what it is today?
Sure, of course. And so I and we kind of walk through this a bit in the book, and I obviously don't speak for any of these activists or for their groups, but I cover them and I talk to them a lot, and I think I have some sense of kind of the history and the arc of these organizations and this movement, right? And so when you look at Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black lives broadly, right, which is kind of how the movement is described, because Black Lives Matter is an individual organization, but also is what people refer to as the full protest movement, right? The term Black Lives Matter comes from, as a hashtag, was something that was created by this set of women, Lisa Garza, Opal Tometi, and then Patrice Colliers, after the George Zimmerman verdict in 2013, after the decision not to convict George Zimmerman in the death of Trayvon Martin. And as everyone was reeling after that, and these vigils are popping up across the country, Alicia Garza writes a Facebook status that she describes as a love letter to Black people. She described this idea that, she says essentially, Black people, I love you, our lives matter, Black lives matter, right? And as she begins talking with Patrice and Opal, they say that has, like, they could see the poetry in that, this idea that, like, Black Lives Matter, like they could hear the strength of that as a calling card or as a slogan. And so they started developing an organization around that idea, right? And an ideology around that idea. And so that begins in 2013. 2014, you fast forward to Ferguson, Missouri, you have the death of Michael Brown, the police shooting, you have thousands of people take to the street, demanding change, demanding justice in this case, as well as changes to how they are policed broadly. And we begin to see kind of an overlap of the two. In the meantime, the three women have begun building a network. They begin founding some chapters at various points across the country. And they've also found like-minded allies, people in various groups across the country, whether it be Baltimore Block in Baltimore, the Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis, or Million Hoodies United and the Dream Defenders in Florida. And so there's this network of Black activist groups. And they begin all lending support to the groups that are now popping up in Ferguson, Missouri. Eventually, these protests, which break out not just here, but you also have protests in Ohio, led largely by the Ohio Student Association, so a different organization, group protests in New York by groups like the NYC Justice League, right? So you're seeing these like demonstrations popping up all over the country, and very soon they are collectively known as the Black Lives Matter protest movement, right? That people start, that phrasing starts popping up in place after place, and that in each individual place, the national network is starting to support them. And so that kind of, in many ways, I think is the origin, right? Is that you had these incidents time and time again, whether it be Oscar Grant, Jordan Davis, Trayvon Martin, Troy Davis, right? Where you had the Jena 6, where you had Black people feeling as if their lives were being devalued. And I think that built the momentum over time and then led to it led to this kind of critical mass of Black frustration and anxiety that then boiled over in Ferguson, and that propelled the movement forward. And so as we go from 2014 to 2015, we continue to see more cities, Charleston, Cleveland, Sandra Bland. We're seeing more videos. We're seeing people being killed, Walter Scott and Sam Du Bois, right? And we start to see that there's a staying power here. Everyone thought that like it was just a bunch of people who were angry in the streets in Ferguson, and then when they weren't going to charge the officer, everyone's going to get over this. Who cares, right? And then you'd see the next video, and you'd see the next city, then you see the next video, and the next city, and it was this empowering. It was kind of this trickle effect from city to city.
Wow. I'm curious to know, like, from your vantage point, because you're reporting on this continuously, is there good that you have seen come from this movement to this point that might not have otherwise happened without it?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think so. I think to begin with, this was not an issue that was at the forefront of our domestic conversation. Yep. The way that Black people interact with the police was just not something that we were talking about to the same extent. We were having conversations about stop and frisk in New York and in some other cities, but we were not having this type of conversation about police use of force. And police departments were not having this conversation about use of force and about potential reform that they are now having only because of this political pressure that was created, right? I also think that we've seen groups and organizations founded that work both in policy as well as in local organizing, and that this kind of ongoing movement has empowered them, right? And so we're seeing groups that are working to empower Black men and Black women, and some of those groups have only been founded during this period of time because of the kind of political energy that's been created. And so we've seen, like I said, focus at the local level. We've also seen focus at the national level, right? We've got President of the United States and the Attorney General who are talking about issues of racial equity, and who are talking about issues of police reform and criminal justice reform. I definitely think that the protest movement has applied pressure in spaces that we wouldn't see otherwise, right? We've also seen, some strides in police accountability and police reform. Now, not everywhere, But we have seen some of that. We've seen district attorneys, more law and order, lock 'em up district attorneys get run out in favor of reformers who might be more progressive or more thoughtful in terms of their sentencing guidelines or, how they're dealing with folks, right? We've seen we've seen a series of police chiefs and police departments decide that they're going to try to review their use of force policies or be more transparent about their reporting of data, right? And we've also seen hundreds of police departments that have started using body camera programs and starting developing policies around police transparency. I think all of those things are net positives.
Right.
And I think it would be very hard to see a world in which all of them happened. I mean, certainly some of those things probably would have happened, but that all of those things happened to the extent that they have, if it weren't for the political pressure. The thing about protests is we all, for the most part, are kind of uncomfortable with them because the point of a protest is to be disruptive, right? It's to shut the highway down when you're driving to work. It's to it's to interrupt that speech that you're trying to listen to. The point is to shake the status quo and make people uncomfortable and force them to pay attention, right? And so we often see we see this historically with almost any civil rights protest, no matter what it is, right? The Birmingham boycotts, the Freedom Summer, right? You always see protests don't ever poll well. Majority of Americans are always that riffraff needs to get out of the street. What are they doing, right? But the point is that you agitate and you make people pay attention, you make people listen. And so I definitely think unquestionably, certainly in the policing space, there have been changes that have only happened because of these protests, because those protests have created political pressure and political will to make some changes.
Right. Wes, of course, I'm still trying to understand how we get people of all races in the country kind of behind the great mission of the racial justice movement in America, right? Any idea on how, this movement moves more people than just Black people towards this bigger mission?
Well, and I think it can be difficult. I think it is difficult. I think it's one of the major challenges, right? That Black people, we are still a relatively small amount of the population, right? We don't, and so that there's this level of coalition building that is to some extent required, no matter what, to see change. But I think it's difficult because I think that there's an impression across the country and with many people, as has long been the case, that giving equity or equality to historically oppressed people is somehow requires taking something from them. And so I think that can be very difficult, and I think there are always people who are going to be skeptical. I think that guilt plays a large factor in our inability or unwillingness to have some of these conversations as well, because to admit that we live in a world where people aren't treated fairly or that there are inequities that linger requires many people to admit that perhaps some of what they have received or achieved because the rules have been skewed towards them, right? And I think that is very uncomfortable for a lot of white people, right? This idea that, wait, what do you mean I had advantages? I don't think I have any advantages. I don't understand. I think that can be very frustrating for people who feel like they've worked really hard and they followed the rules and they don't hate anybody. And so I think that can be really difficult. And I think that's something that has to be navigated.
We obviously have no idea how the president-elect and his administration, will help or hurt. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's unclear. Now, the president-elect has said, that he doesn't necessarily, he seems to not be an ally of many of the things that, kind of the protest movement and the racial justice movement have advocated for. He seems to be an opponent of many of those things as it relates to collection of data or federal oversight of policing, certainly. And so I think there could be, some massive shifts in terms of what the federal government's posture towards the movement is. I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see activists and protest leaders in the White House meeting with President Trump the way they were meeting with President Obama. I think it's probably unlikely to see the Department of Justice being so critical and launching these investigations into police departments the way they did under President Obama. I think it's much more likely that the Department of Justice plays a much more hands-off role as it relates to police departments. And so, I think that there's a lot. I think it's going to be really difficult to see, in terms of how the federal government continues interacting in these spaces. But the other thing is that, policing and criminal justice is fundamentally kind of a local issue in the way that we are structured, that you have 18,000 police departments, 19,000 police departments, and they don't have much federal oversight. And so even if you have a, president or attorney general who are not particularly interested in these issues, there's still space and potential for this work to be done at local levels, even if the federal government isn't that interested in continuing to do some of it.
Right. That said, are you planning to remain as actively involved as you've been in the past couple of years?
Oh, I think I definitely will. I mean, there's a ton of stories, there's gonna be a ton of things to cover, a ton of conversations to have. I don't think that there's much chance that I'll be switching beats anytime soon, because I just think there's gonna be a ton to write about.
Right. Hopefully good.
Yeah, hopefully.
Wes, we're about to wrap up, but I want to give you an opportunity once again to share how those listening can get involved, get a copy of the book, and stay connected to you.
Of course. And so the book is called They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement. It is available pretty much everywhere. Should be in your local bookstore, should be in your airport bookstore, and it's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Audible and all those great places. It's available now. Go buy it. Buy like 5 copies. And if you can't figure out how to buy it, you can reach out to me. I'm just at Wesley Lowery on every platform, on Facebook, on Twitter, Wesley Lowery, national reporter for the Washington Post. And like I said, anyone has any questions, any difficult, finding the book, anything, hit me up. I'm real accessible. My email's all over the internet, and I'd be happy to help.
Wes, thank you very much for the heartfelt conversation, man. I'm happy we had the discussion. I hope that it helps those listening in some way to take part in a constructive way, right, towards, moving us, helping move things forward. And I think you did a great job. I really, really appreciate having you on. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me, buddy. I appreciate it.
Well, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Trailblazers podcast. I'll be posting links to all of today's book recommendations and links mentioned on our show notes page at tbpod.com. If today was your first time listening to the Trailblazers podcast, I just want to extend a warm Trailblazers welcome to you. We're so happy to have you here, and we encourage you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button in your favorite podcast app. Go ahead and browse through some of our past episodes to keep the knowledge flowing. If you're a fan of the podcast and today's content, and you're maybe already subscribed to the podcast, please continue to share and invite your friends, your family, your colleagues to listen to an episode that you think might impact them most. We believe that someone listening to these inspiring stories will be moved to make significant changes that will have generational impact for many others, both now and well into the future. Don't miss next week's episode. New episodes are released each and every Monday by about 5 a.m. Eastern. Trailblazers, jump off this podcast today. Go find a way to rise above, go way beyond, and keep blazing your trail. Cheers.